The old woman Maya dragged from the snow was barely alive. 20 minutes later, her billionaire grandson walked through the door, broke down in tears, and made Maya an offer that would either save her or destroy everything she'd fought to protect. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that reach further than we could ever imagine. For Maya Chun, a 26-year-old waitress working double shifts at a modest cafe on the edge of downtown, kindness wasn't a choice, it was survival. When you've lived through hardship, when you've felt the cold bite of the world's indifference, you recognize it in others. And on that brutal February evening when the snow fell like frozen knives and the wind howled through the empty streets, Maya recognized it in the eyes of an elderly woman huddled against a brick wall, her thin coat no match for winter's fury. The cafe where Maya worked, Riverside Corner, wasn't much to look at. It was the kind of place that survived on regulars, cheap coffee, and the promise of warmth on cold days. The owner, M.R. Patel, was a good man who paid fair wages and didn't ask too many questions about why a college graduate was serving soup and sandwiches instead of using her sociology degree. Maya was grateful for that. After her mother's death 2 years ago and the mountain of medical debt that came with it, she'd learned that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She wore her uniform with dignity, smiled at customers who barely saw her, and saved every dollar she could. That evening, the cafe was nearly empty. The weather forecast had warned of a major storm, and anyone with sense had already gone home. Maya was wiping down tables, preparing to close early, when she glanced out the frosted window and saw her. The woman was old, probably in her 80s, with silver hair that had come loose from its bun, whipping around her face in the wind. She wore a wool coat that had seen better days, clutching it closed with hands that trembled from more than just cold. She was trying to walk, but each step seemed to cost her. Maya watched as the woman stumbled, caught herself against the wall, and then slowly slid down to a sitting position on the snow-covered sidewalk. Maya didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk or consider the inconvenience. She simply moved. Grabbing her own worn parka from the hook by the door, she ran outside into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath, but she pushed through it. The woman was barely conscious when Maya reached her, her lips tinged blue, her breathing shallow. Maya knelt beside her, wrapping the parka around the woman's shoulders. The woman's eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice so faint Maya had to lean close to hear. "You're safe now," Maya said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. The woman was dangerously cold. Maya looked around the empty street. No cars, no help. The storm had turned the city into a ghost town. She made a decision. Sliding her arms under the woman's frail body, Maya lifted her with a strength born of desperation. The woman weighed almost nothing, as if life had already begun to leave her bones. Maya carried her back to the cafe, pushing through the door with her shoulder, and immediately the warmth of the interior embraced them both. Miss Patel rushed over from behind the counter, his eyes wide with concern. "Maya, what happened?" "Call an ambulance," Maya said, her voice tight with urgency as she carefully lowered the woman into a booth. "She's hypothermic. I found her outside." Mr. Patel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the phone while Maya stripped off the wet outer layers of the woman's clothing, replacing them with dry tablecloths and her own parka. She rubbed the woman's hands between hers, trying to bring warmth back into the icy fingers. The woman's eyes were open now, watching Maya with an intensity that seemed out of place in someone so fragile. "Why did you help me?" the woman asked, her voice gaining a bit of strength. Maya paused in her ministrations, meeting the woman's gaze. "'Cause no one should be alone in the cold," she said simply. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Maya saw something in them that looked like recognition. As if Maya had just answered a question the woman had been asking her entire life. "What's your name, dear?" the woman asked. "Maya Chun. And yours?" The woman hesitated, a flicker of something, fear, sadness, crossing her face. Margaret Ashford." Mr. Patel returned with a thermal blanket he kept in the back office and a mug of hot tea. "The ambulance is on its way, but with the storm, it might be 20 minutes or more." Maya nodded, continuing to work on warming Margaret's extremities. She'd taken a basic first aid course years ago during her brief time in college, and she was grateful for every scrap of knowledge now. Sipped the tea slowly, color gradually returning to her cheeks. As the minutes passed, she seemed to grow stronger, but there was a sadness in her eyes that the warmth couldn't touch. "I was trying to get home," Margaret said quietly, staring into her tea. "I don't drive anymore, and the bus never came. I thought I could walk, it's not far, but then the cold and I got confused." "Where is home?" Maya asked gently. Margaret gave an address on the north side of the city, an area Maya knew was full of old mansions and quiet streets lined with ancient oak. It was at least 5 miles from where they were now. "You walked from there?" Maya asked, incredulous. "How long were you out there?" "I'm not sure," Margaret admitted. "Time gets away from me sometimes. I just needed to get out. The house is so empty. So quiet. Sometimes I forget why I stay." There was a profound loneliness in those words that Maya recognized all too well. After her mother died, Maya had spent months in their small apartment, surrounded by memories and silence, wondering the same thing. Why stay? What was the point? But she had stayed. had kept moving forward because that's what you do. You survive. You find small reasons to keep going. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those small reasons add up to something that feels almost like living. You're not alone now, Maya said, squeezing Margaret's hand. The older woman looked at her, and fresh tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. You remind me of someone, Margaret said softly. Someone I lost a long time ago. My daughter. She had your same kindness, your same fire. She would have done exactly what you did today, would have, Maya asked gently, understanding the weight of that past tense. Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Cancer. 23 years ago. She was only 32. Left behind a son, my grandson. He was just 9 years old. Maya felt her heart constrict. I'm so sorry, she said, and she meant it. Margaret wiped her eyes with the edge of the tablecloth. After she died, my grandson, he pulled away from me. Built walls so high I couldn't reach him. He's a successful man now, very wealthy, very powerful. But he's also very alone, just like his grandmother. The door to the cafe suddenly swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and snow. A tall man in an expensive black overcoat stepped inside, shaking snow from his dark hair. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that scanned the room with the assessing gaze of someone used to evaluating situations quickly. His clothes were immaculate despite the storm, his shoes polished to a mere shine. This was someone who existed in a different world, where cars were always waiting, where doors opened before you reached them, where cold was something that happened to other people. His eyes swept past Maya as if she were part of the furniture and locked onto Margaret. The color drained from his face. Grandmother? He said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been fear. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. What are you doing here? Where's Mrs. Patterson? Why aren't you at home? Margaret looked up at him, her expression a complicated mixture of love and resignation. Alexander, I didn't expect you. The man Alexander seemed to notice Maya for the first time. His eyes, a striking gray like storm clouds, flickered to her and then back to his grandmother. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he was about to say died on his lips as he took in the scene. His grandmother wrapped in a parka and tablecloths, her wet coat hanging on a nearby chair, the emergency thermal blanket, the mug of tea in her trembling hands. What happened? He asked, and for the first time his voice cracked with genuine emotion. She was outside in the storm, Maya said quietly. I found her collapsed on the sidewalk. She was hypothermic. I brought her in and called for help. Alexander's face went through a series of transformations, shock, horror, and then something that looked like devastating guilt. He sank into the booth opposite Margaret, his expensive coat pooling around him, and for a moment he looked like nothing more than a lost child. You were outside? In this storm? Grandmother, you could have died. I needed air, Margaret said, her voice small. The house was so quiet, Alexander. So empty. I just wanted to feel something other than alone, and that's when it happened. Alexander Ashford, a man Maya would later learn was worth billions, a titan of industry who commanded boardrooms and influenced markets, covered his face with his hands and began to cry. The sound of a powerful man breaking was unlike anything Maya had ever heard. It wasn't the quiet, dignified tears she'd seen at her mother's funeral, or the angry sobs of frustration she'd cried herself to sleep with on the worst nights. This was something raw and primal. The sound of a dam finally bursting after years of holding back an ocean. Alexander's shoulders shook as he pressed his palms against his eyes, as if he could physically push the emotion back inside, but it was too late. The fortress had cracked, and everything he'd been holding inside was pouring out. Margaret reached across the table with her still trembling hand and placed it on her grandson's arm. Alexander, she said softly. But he shook his head violently, unable to speak. Maya stood frozen, unsure whether to give them privacy or stay in case she was needed. Mr. Patel had quietly retreated to the kitchen, understanding that this was a moment too intimate for strangers. But Maya felt rooted to the spot, watching this scene unfold with a mixture of compassion and recognition. She knew what it looked like when someone finally let themselves feel the weight of what they'd been running from. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute, Alexander lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face blotchy in a way that made him look younger, more human. He looked at his grandmother with an expression of such profound anguish that Maya felt her own throat tighten. I almost lost you, he said, his voice hoarse. If this woman hadn't found you, if she hadn't been brave enough to go out in that storm, you would have died alone on a sidewalk, and it would have been my fault. But you didn't lose me, Margaret said gently. I'm here. Because of her. Both of them turned to look at Maya, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. Alexander stood up, wiping his face with the back of his hand in a gesture that was oddly boyish. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", and when he straightened to his full height, he carried an unmistakable authority. But his eyes, when they met Maya's, were vulnerable and grateful in a way that transcended his wealth and power. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice still rough with emotion. You saved her life. My grandmother is everything to me, and I let my own stupidity, my own cowardice, nearly cost me the only family I have left. Maya shifted uncomfortably. I just did what anyone would do, she said. No, Alexander said firmly, taking a step closer. Most people would have walked past. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. You risked your own safety to save a stranger. That's not something anyone would do. That's something extraordinary. Before Maya could respond, The wail of sirens announced the arrival of the ambulance. 2 paramedics pushed through the door, bringing with them a rush of cold air and professional efficiency. They immediately went to Margaret, asking questions, taking vitals, preparing her for transport. One of them, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, looked at Maya. "You're the one who found her?" Maya nodded. "Good work," the paramedic said. "Another 20 minutes out there and we'd be having a very different conversation." Alexander accompanied his grandmother to the ambulance, insisting on riding with her to the hospital. But before he left, he turned back to Maya. "I need your name," he said. "Your full name, and a way to contact you." Maya hesitated. She'd learned to be wary of promises from wealthy people. They often offered grand gestures and moments of emotion that evaporated once the crisis passed. But there was something in Alexander's eyes that seemed genuine, a desperate sincerity that reminded her of how she'd felt when the nurses had saved her mother's life, if only for a few more months. "Maya Chun," she said. "I work here most days. That's all you need to know." Alexander pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, pressing it into her hand. "Please," he said, "call me tomorrow. I want to repay you properly." Maya looked down at the card. It was heavy stock, embossed with elegant lettering. Alexander Ashford, Chief Executive Officer, Ashford Industries. There was a phone number and an email address. She slipped it into her pocket without comment. "Just take care of her," Maya said. "That's all the repayment I need." Alexander held her gaze for a long moment, and Maya saw something shift in his expression, a kind of determination settling over the raw emotion. "You have my word," he said. And then he was gone, following the paramedics out into the storm. The cafe felt impossibly quiet after they left. Mr. Patel emerged from the kitchen, his expression thoughtful. "That was Alexander Ashford," he said, "not quite a question." Maya shrugged, picking up Margaret's abandoned teacup and carrying it to the sink. "I guess so." Mr. Patel let out a low whistle. "His company owns half the commercial real estate in this city. He's one of the wealthiest men in the state. And you just saved his grandmother's life." Maya ran hot water over the cup, watching the remaining tea swirl down the drain. "Doesn't change anything," she said. "He's still just a man, and she's still just a person who needed help." But even as she said it, Maya felt the weight of the business card in her pocket like a promise or a threat. That night, alone in her small studio apartment, Maya couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Margaret's face, the profound loneliness in her eyes, the way she'd said the house was so empty. She thought about Alexander's breakdown, the way he'd covered his face and cried like a child. There was a story there, a deep well of pain and regret that Maya recognized because she'd lived in that same well after her mother died. She pulled out Alexander's business card and studied it under the dim light of her bedside lamp. She could throw it away, forget this ever happened, go back to her life of double shifts and careful budgeting, or she could make the call and step into something unknown. The next morning, Maya woke to find 3 missed calls and 2 voicemails on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. The first voicemail was brief. "Ms. Chun, this is Alexander Ashford. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I'd like to speak with you about yesterday." The second was longer, and his voice sounded tired, strained. "Ms. Chun, Maya, please. I know you said taking care of my grandmother was enough, but I need to see you. There's something I need to say, something I need to explain. My grandmother's asking for you. She's at Memorial Hospital. Room 412. Please come if you can. She wants to thank you herself." Maya listened to the messages 3 times, trying to read between the words. Margaret was asking for her. That detail stuck with Maya more than Alexander's obvious desperation. She remembered the way Margaret had looked at her, the way she'd said, "You remind me of someone." There was a connection there, fragile and new, but real. Maya checked her work schedule. Had the day off, a rare gift from Mr. Patel, who'd insisted she'd take it after the drama of the previous evening. She had no excuse not to go. And truthfully, she wanted to see Margaret again, wanted to make sure the old woman was truly okay. Memorial Hospital was in the affluent part of the city, all gleaming glass and modern architecture. Maya felt out of place the moment she walked through the automatic doors in her worn jeans and secondhand coat. The lobby was more like a hotel than a hospital, with marble floors and a grand piano playing soft music in the corner. She approached the information desk, gave Margaret's name, and was directed to the 4th floor, private wing. The elevator ride up felt like ascending into another world. When the doors opened, the hallway was carpeted, quiet, with artwork on the walls and private rooms that probably cost more per night than Maya made in a week. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. Maya paused outside the door, suddenly nervous. What was she doing here? She'd saved a life, yes, but that didn't make her part of these people's world. She was about to turn and leave when the door opened and Alexander stood there as if he'd been waiting for her. "Miss Chun," he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." He stepped aside and Maya entered the room. It was spacious and sunlit, more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. And there, sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better than she had the night before, was Margaret. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, her color had returned, and her eyes were bright and alert. But when she saw Maya, those eyes filled with tears. "My dear girl," Margaret said, reaching out her hand. "Come here, let me look at you." Maya crossed to the bed and took Margaret's hand. The old woman's grip was surprisingly strong. "You saved my life," Margaret said simply. "In more ways than you know." Maya felt her cheeks flush. "I'm just glad you're okay." "More than okay," Margaret said. "The doctors say I'm going to make a full recovery. But that's not why I asked you here." She glanced at Alexander, who stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "We both need to talk to you about something important, something we should have addressed a long time ago." Alexander turned from the window, and Maya saw that same vulnerability from the night before in his eyes. "Miss Chun, Maya," he began, then paused, struggling with the words. "When I saw my grandmother last night, when I realized how close I came to losing her because of my own neglect, it broke something that needed to be broken." He took a deep breath. "I've spent the last 23 years building walls, becoming someone I thought I needed to be, someone strong, untouchable, successful. I told myself I was honoring my mother's memory by being successful, by making the family name mean something. But the truth is I was just running from grief, from connection, from the one person who loved me unconditionally." Margaret squeezed Maya's hand. "After my daughter died," Margaret said softly, "Alexander was only 9. He was devastated, and in his pain he pushed me away. And I, in my own grief, let him. We became strangers, living in the same house until he left for boarding school at 13. We've been strangers ever since, seeing each other at holidays, exchanging pleasantries, but never really connecting, never really healing. And yesterday, when I nearly died alone in the snow, when this brave young woman risked herself to save me, it forced us both to confront what we've lost." Maya stood between these two people, feeling the weight of their shared grief pressing against her like a physical force. She understood loss intimately. She'd held her mother's hand as cancer slowly stole her away, had watched a vibrant woman fade to a whisper, had felt the unbearable silence that came after, but she'd never had the luxury of walls or distance. She'd been alone with her grief, forced to face it head on because there was no one else, no family to push away, no fortune to hide behind. Looking at Alexander and Margaret, she saw what happened when grief was given room to metastasize, to grow into something that poised not just memory, but the present, the future, everything. "I don't understand why you're telling me this," Maya said quietly, though part of her did understand. They saw her as a catalyst, the stranger who'd walked into their frozen world and brought warmth, but she wasn't sure she wanted that role. She had her own life, her own struggles. Getting involved with wealthy people and their complicated family dynamics felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice that looked solid but might crack at any moment. "Because you showed me something I'd forgotten," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "When I saw you run out into that storm without hesitation, when I watched you care for a stranger with such tenderness, it reminded me of my mother, of who she was, who she taught me to be before I forgot." Margaret nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "My daughter Catherine, she was like you, Maya. She saw people, really saw them. She volunteered at shelters, spent her Saturdays serving meals to the homeless, donated more than money. She donated her time, her attention, her heart. When she got sick, she made me promise something, made us both promise." She looked at Alexander, and Maya saw a flicker of pain cross his face. "She made us promise not to let grief turn us into ghosts, to keep living, keep loving, keep seeing the people around us, and we broke that promise. Both of us. We became exactly what she feared, empty shells going through the motions of life without actually living." The room fell silent except for the distant beep of monitors and the muffled sounds of the hospital beyond the door. Maya felt tears prickling at her own eyes, thinking of her mother's final words to her. "Don't let this make you bitter, baby. Stay soft, stay kind. The world needs more softness." Maya had tried to honor that, had tried to stay kind even when the world felt cruel, but it had cost her. Kindness without resources meant stretching yourself thin, meant giving when you had nothing to give, meant sometimes going hungry so others could eat. It meant being tired, always so tired, but still showing up because what else was there? "What do you want from me?" Maya asked, and she heard the exhaustion in her own voice. Alexander and Margaret exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. "Nothing you don't want to give," Margaret said, "but we'd like to know you, to spend time with you." And Alexander added, stepping forward, "I'd like to help you, in whatever way you'll allow." Maya stiffened. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Alexander said quickly. "It's gratitude, and perhaps, if you'll allow it, friendship. My grandmother lives alone in a house with 20 rooms and feels abandoned. I live alone in a penthouse and feel exactly the same. You saved her life, but maybe, just maybe, you could help save ours too." The vulnerability in his words disarmed her. This wasn't the confident CEO the billionaire used to getting his way. This was a man who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what connection felt like. Maya looked at Margaret, saw the hope in the old woman's eyes, and felt her resistance crumbling. She thought about her own loneliness, the empty apartment she returned to every night, and the way she sometimes went days without a real conversation beyond taking orders and making small talk with customers. Maybe they needed each other. Maybe that was okay. "I work most days," Maya said slowly. "Double shifts usually. I don't have much free time." "Then let me help with that," Alexander said immediately. "Let's me hire you, give you a position that pays better, gives you more time, more flexibility." Maya shook her head. I don't want a job I didn't earn. I want to work for my money. Then work for it, Alexander said. My company has a community outreach division. We fund programs for underserved populations, but if I'm honest, it's been run by people who've never experienced hardship, who don't understand the communities they're supposed to serve. You have a sociology degree, Margaret told me. Use it. Help us do better. Help me build programs that actually matter. Maya was startled. How did you know about my degree? I looked you up, Margaret admitted without shame. After Alexander told me your name, I had my assistant research you. I know about your mother, about the medical debt, about how you dropped out of graduate school to care for her. I know you're working 2 jobs and still barely making ends meet. And I know that despite all of that, you still ran out into a storm to save a stranger. The invasion of privacy should have angered Maya, but instead she felt oddly seen. These people, with all their resources and privilege, had taken the time to understand her story. That meant something. What kind of work? Maya asked cautiously. Real work, Alexander said, and she could hear the passion entering his voice for the first time. Designing programs, visiting communities, identifying needs, and creating solutions. You'd have a budget, a team, the authority to make real change, and you'd be helping people who are where you've been, who need someone who understands. It's not charity, Maya. It's hiring the right person for a job that desperately needs doing. And the pay? Maya asked, hating herself for being mercenary, but needing to know. Enough to clear your mother's medical debt, Alexander said quietly. Enough to live uncomfortably while you do work that matters. Maya's breath caught. Her mother's debt was an anchor around her neck. $37,000 that grew with interest faster than she could pay it down. It would take her years at her current pace, years of double shifts and cheap ramen and never being able to save for a future. The temptation was overwhelming, but something held her back. Why are you really doing this? She asked, looking Alexander directly in the eye. Is this guilt? Are you trying to buy absolution for neglecting your grandmother? Alexander met her gaze without flinching. Maybe partly, he admitted, but mostly I'm doing it because yesterday when I broke down in that cafe, something shifted in me. I realized I'd been living a half-life, going through motions, achieving success by every metric except the ones that matter. My mother died wanting me to be someone who helped people, who saw people. And I became someone who just accumulated wealth and power. You reminded me who I wanted to be, who I promised her I'd be. There was a knock at the door and a nurse entered to check Margaret's vitals. The interruption gave Maya time to think. She watched the nurse work efficiently, professionally, and thought about all the nurses who'd cared for her mother, the kindness they'd shown even when overwhelmed. One nurse, Patricia, had held Maya while she cried the night her mother died, had stayed past her shift to sit with her. People helping people. That was what mattered. That was what her mother had believed in. If Alexander was offering her a chance to do that on a larger scale, to help people who were struggling the way she had struggled, could she really say no out of pride? The nurse finished and left, and the 3 of them were alone again. Maya took a deep breath. I need to think about it, she said. This is a lot, and I don't make big decisions quickly. That's wise, Margaret said approvingly. Take all the time you need. But while you're thinking, would you consider having dinner with us, with me at my house? Nothing formal, nothing with strings attached, just a meal and conversation. I'd like to hear about your mother if you're willing to share, and I'd like to tell you about Catherine, about the daughter I loved and lost. Maybe in sharing our grief, we can both carry it a little lighter. Maya found herself nodding before she consciously decided to. Okay, she said, I can do dinner. When? Tonight if you're available, Margaret said. I'm being discharged this afternoon. The doctors wanted to keep me longer, but I've convinced them I'll recover better at home, especially now that I have a reason to want to be there. She looked at Alexander with such love and hope that Maya felt her chest tighten. My grandson has promised to stay with me for a while to make up for lost time, and having you there would make it perfect. A new beginning for all of us. Alexander pulled out his phone. I'll send a car for you at 7, he said. Or if you prefer, I can pick you up myself. Just text me your address. Maya shook her head. I'll take the bus. I know the neighborhood. I'll find it. She saw Alexander about to protest, saw him register the pride in her voice, and watched him make the conscious decision. Respect it. All right, he said. 7 o'clock then. And Maya, thank you for everything, for saving her, for giving us a chance, for reminding me what matters. Maya left the hospital with Alexander's business card back in her pocket, Margaret's address written on the back in the old woman's elegant script. As she rode the bus back to her neighborhood, watching the city transform from gleaming towers to struggling streets, she felt like she was straddling 2 worlds. She didn't know if she belonged in theirs. Didn't know if accepting their help would change her in ways she couldn't predict. Quote, but she thought about her mother's word, stay soft, stay kind. And she thought about the loneliness she'd seen in both their eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. Maybe this wasn't about belonging to their world. Maybe it was about creating a new world together. One where wealth and struggle could meet in the middle and recognize their shared humanity. Maya pulled the cord for her stop and stepped out into the cold afternoon. She had hours before dinner, hours to decide what to wear, how to act, whether to keep her walls up or let them down. As she walked the familiar blocks to her apartment, passing neighbors who nodded in recognition, she realized that whatever happened tonight, her life had already changed. You couldn't save someone without being changed by it. You couldn't witness someone else's grief without it touching your own. And you couldn't be seen, truly seen, by strangers without seeing yourself differently too. That evening, as Maya stood in front of her meager closet trying to find something appropriate to wear to a mansion, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked tired. the shadows under her eyes testament to too many late nights and early morning. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It could lift you up or dash you down. But as Maya finally selected a simple black dress her mother had bought her years ago for a college interview, she decided that maybe it was worth the risk. Maybe kindness deserved to be rewarded, maybe grief deserved to heal, and maybe, just maybe, three lonely people could find in each other what they'd been missing all along. The bus ride to the north side took 40 minutes, and with each mile, the city transformed. The buildings grew larger, more stately. The streets widened, trees appeared where before there had been only concrete. By the time Maya stepped off at her stop, she was in a different world entirely. The evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from expensive fireplaces rather than exhaust fumes. She walked along streets lit by old-fashioned gas lamps, past houses that weren't just homes but estates, each one a testament to generations of accumulated wealth. Margaret's address led her to a sprawling Tudor-style mansion set back from the street behind an iron gate. The house was beautiful in an austere way, all dark timber and stone, with leaded glass windows that glowed warmly from within. Maya stood at the gate for a moment, her finger hovering over the intercom button, feeling the gulf between her world and this one. She thought about turning back, about texting some excuse and returning to the safety of her small apartment. But then she remembered Margaret's face in the hospital, the hope in her eyes when she'd extended the invitation. Maya pressed the button. The gate swung open silently and Maya walked up the curved driveway, her worn boots crunching on pristine gravel. Before she reached the front door, it opened and Alexander stood there. He'd changed from his business attire into dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, and somehow the casual clothes made him seem more approachable, more human. His hair was slightly damp as if he'd recently showered, and without the armor of his expensive suit, Maya could see the toll the last 24 hours had taken on him. There were lines around his eyes she hadn't noticed before, a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. "Maya," he said, and his smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." Maya stepped into a grand foyer with polished marble floors and a sweeping staircase. But what struck her wasn't the obvious wealth, it was the silence. The house was beautiful, impeccably maintained, but it felt like a museum. There was no clutter, no signs of life, no photographs on the walls. It was a house, but it wasn't a home. She understood now why Margaret had fled into the storm. This beautiful prison would drive anyone to desperate measures. Alexander seemed to read her thoughts. "It's too big, isn't it?" he said quietly. "My grandmother refuses to downsize. She says my mother grew up here and leaving would feel like abandoning her memory. But I think she's been haunted by this place for years." Maya followed him through a formal dining room, equally pristine and lifeless, and then into a large kitchen that finally showed signs of actual use. Margaret was there, wearing a soft blue cardigan and slacks, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She was stirring something on the stove, and the smell of homemade soup filled the air. When she saw Maya, her face lit up with such genuine pleasure that Maya felt her defenses crumbling. "Maya, dear," Margaret said, setting down her spoon and crossing to embrace her. "I'm so glad you came. I was worried you'd change your mind." Maya accepted the hug, surprised by how natural it felt. "I almost did," she admitted, "but I wanted to see how you were doing." "Much better," Margaret assured her, "especially now that I'm home and cooking. The doctors wanted me to rest, but cooking is how I rest. It's how I think." She gestured to the pot on the stove. "I'm making my daughter's favorite soup, white bean and kale. Catherine used to say it could cure anything from a cold to a broken heart." Alexander moved to the counter where a cutting board and vegetables waited. He picked up a knife and began chopping with surprising skill. "My mother taught me to cook," he said, not looking up from his work. "She believed everyone should know how to feed themselves and others. Said it was the most basic form of caring. After she died, I stopped cooking, ordered in every meal, ate at restaurants, anything to avoid being in a kitchen. But last night, after we got home from the hospital, my grandmother and I stood in here for the first time in years. Really stood here together, and we decided we were going to make her soup." His voice grew thick. "I'd forgotten how much I loved it, how much I loved the ritual of it." Maya felt like she was watching something profound unfold. These two people, separated by grief for over 2 decades, were finding their way back to each other through the simple act of preparing a meal. It reminded her of the last weeks with her mother when eating had become difficult, but the act of sitting together, of sharing space and time, had been everything. "Can I help?" Maya asked. Margaret handed her an apron with a smile. "You can set the table. Alexander will show you where everything is. But Maya, please feel free to explore. This house has been silent for too long. It needs to remember what it's like to have life in it again." Setting the table became an exploration. Alexander led her to a formal dining room, but Margaret called after them, "Not there. Let's eat in the breakfast nook. It's where Catherine always wanted to eat. More cozy." The breakfast nook was a glass-enclosed room off the kitchen filled with plants and overlooking a garden that was winter bare but beautifully landscaped. A round oak table sat in the center, and as Maya set out plates and silverware, she noticed photographs on a nearby shelf. She stepped closer and found herself looking at Catherine Ashford. The woman in the photos was beautiful, with Alexander's gray eyes and Margaret's elegant bone structure. But it was her smile that caught Maya's attention. It was open, genuine, full of warmth. In one photo, she was holding a young Alexander, maybe 4 or 5, and they were both laughing at something off camera. In another, she was at what looked like a soup kitchen, serving meals, her hair tied back, wearing an apron splattered with food. In a third, she was older, thinner, clearly ill, but still smiling, still radiant with something that transcended physical suffering. This was the woman who had made them both promise not to become ghosts. This was the connection they'd lost and were trying to find again. She looks like she was an incredible person, Maya said softly. Alexander had come up behind her so quietly she hadn't heard him. He stood there looking at the photos with an expression that was part love, part grief, part regret. She was, he said. She was the best person I've ever known. She got sick, I was 16. Old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to believe that if I was just good enough, achieved enough, made her proud enough, maybe she'd get better. He laughed bitterly, as if cancer cares about a teenager's grades or soccer trophies. When she died, I felt like I'd failed her, and I couldn't stand to be around anything or anyone that reminded me of that failure, including my grandmother. That must have hurt Margaret so much, Maya said, and Alexander nodded. I know that now, but at the time I was so consumed by my own pain I couldn't see hers. She'd lost her daughter, her only child, and instead of being there for her, I pulled away, punished her for surviving when my mother didn't. I moved out as soon as I could, threw myself into building a company, making money, achieving success. I told myself I was honoring my mother's memory by being successful, but really I was just running. And I've been running for 23 years, till yesterday, when I realized I'd almost lost the only family I had left because I was too much of a coward to face my own grief. Dinner is ready, Margaret called from the kitchen, and Alexander seemed grateful for the interruption. They carried the soup and fresh bread to the breakfast nook, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Maya sat down to a meal that felt like family. The soup was rich and hearty, the bread still warm from the oven. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Margaret began to talk. She told stories about Catherine, about her kindness and humor, about the time she'd donated her entire college fund to build a community center and had worked 3 jobs to put herself through school, about how she'd fallen in love with James Ashford, a lawyer who shared her passion for justice, and how devastated she'd been when he died in a car accident when Alexander was only 2. She raised you alone after that, Margaret said, looking at Alexander with pride. Did it with such grace and strength. She never remarried, said she'd had her great love and didn't need another. She poured everything into you, taught you to be kind and brave and to always stand up for what's right. Alexander's hands tightened around his soup bowl. And I forgot all of it, he said. Forgot everything she taught me. I became exactly what she wouldn't have wanted. A man who cared more about profit margins than people. Who walked past suffering because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Who let his own grandmother become so lonely she nearly died in the snow. You're not that man anymore, Maya heard herself say. Both Alexander and Margaret turned to look at her. You're here, aren't you? Maya continued. You're facing what you ran from. That takes more courage than running ever did. I know, because I've done both. When my mother got sick, I wanted to run. I wanted to pretend it wasn't happening, to go on with my life and let the hospital handle it, but I didn't. I stayed. I held her hand through every treatment, every setback, every moment of pain, and when she died, I wanted to run again. But I stayed in that apartment, surrounded by her things, forcing myself to feel it all, because that's what love demands. It demands that we stay, that we witness, that we honor the people we've lost by living the way they wanted us to live. The words poured out of her months of grief and exhaustion and determination crystallized into a truth she hadn't fully articulated before. Her mother had wanted her to stay soft, stay kind, and she had. It had nearly broken her, but she had. And now, sitting in this beautiful haunted house with these broken, beautiful people, she realized that maybe that was the point. Maybe staying soft in a hard world, staying kind in the face of cruelty was the most revolutionary act there was. And maybe that's what Alexander was trying to do now. Not run anymore. Not hide behind walls of wealth and achievement, but stay, witness, feel, honor. Margaret reached across the table and took Maya's hand in one of hers and Alexander's in the other. My Catherine would have loved you, she said to Maya, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. You have her heart, her fire. And then, turning to Alexander, and she would be so proud of the man you're becoming, not the man you were pretending to have it all together, but this man, the one who can cry, who can admit he's been lost, who's brave enough to find his way back. They sat there, 3 people connected by loss and hope, and the fragile, powerful act of choosing to be vulnerable with each other. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, covering the garden in a blanket of white. But inside, in the warm glow of the breakfast nook, something frozen was beginning to thaw. Something that had been lost was being found. And Maya realized that saving Margaret from the storm hadn't been the end of anything, it had been the beginning. After dinner, Margaret excused herself to rest, exhausted but happier than Maya had seen her. Alexander walked Maya to the front door, but instead of saying goodbye, he paused with his hand on the doorknob. Don't go yet, he said. There's something I want to show you. If you have time. Maya checked her phone. It was only 9 and she didn't work until noon the next day. She nodded, curious about what could make this composed man suddenly seem nervous. Alexander led her up the sweeping staircase to the 2nd floor. The hallway was lined with closed doors, rooms that probably hadn't been opened in years. But at the end of the hall, one door stood ajar, light spilling out. Alexander pushed it open and Maya stepped into what had clearly been Catherine's office. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was alive with personality. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, children's drawings, and thank you notes. There were bookshelves crammed with volumes on social justice, community organizing, and nonprofit management. A large desk sat beneath a window, its surface cluttered with old notebooks and files. After she died, Alexander said quietly, my grandmother couldn't bear to change anything. She locked the door and left it exactly as it was the last day my mother sat here. I haven't been in this room in 23 years, but last night after we got back from the hospital, I asked her to open it. Maya walked slowly around the room, taking it in. This was Catherine's heart, preserved in paper and ink. On the desk was an old journal, and Alexander gestured to it. She kept journals, he said, wrote in them every day. Her thoughts, her plans, her dreams. After you left the hospital today, I came here and started reading. I thought it would hurt too much, but instead it felt like talking to her, like she was here, reminding me who I'm supposed to be. He picked up the journal, handling it with reverence. There's an entry from about a month before she died. I want to read it to you if that's okay. Maya nodded, settling into a worn armchair that probably used to be Catherine's. Alexander sat on the edge of the desk and opened the journal to a marked page. His voice was steady, but Maya could hear the emotion beneath the words. It read, I'm afraid of leaving Alexander, not because I doubt he'll survive, but because I fear what he'll become in his grief. He's so much like his father, so driven to fix things, to control outcome. When I'm gone, I worry he'll try to control death itself by building walls so high that nothing can hurt him. But walls that keep out pain also keep out love. I need him to know that it's okay to break, feel lost, to ask for help. Strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to reach for someone's hand. Alexander's voice cracked on the last sentence. He closed the journal and looked at Maya with eyes that were red but clear. That's exactly what I did. I built those walls. Spent 23 years standing alone, thinking I was being strong. And all I really was isolated, terrified, slowly dying inside while convincing myself I was living. Maya felt tears on her own cheeks. She thought about her mother's final words, so similar in spirit. Our mothers knew, she said softly. They knew what we needed to hear. And maybe we needed to get lost before we could really understand what they were trying to tell us. Alexander wiped his eyes and managed a small smile. Maybe you needed to save my grandmother before I could find my way back. He set the journal down and picked up a folder from the desk. Speaking of finding ways forward, I've been working on something for you. He handed her the folder and Maya opened it. Inside was a detailed job proposal. Director of Community Outreach, Ashford Industry. The salary made her gasp. It was 3 times what she made working her 2 jobs combined. But more than that, the scope of the position was incredible. She would have authority to identify underserved communities, design programs to address their needs, allocate resources, and build partnerships with local organizations. It was everything she'd dreamed of doing with her sociology degree, all the work she'd had to abandon when her mother got sick. This is too much, Maya said, overwhelmed. I don't have the experience for something like this. You have the most important experience, Alexander countered. You've lived it. You know what it's like to struggle, to need help, to be ignored by people who should care. Every other person I've had in this role has been someone from privilege, someone who learned about poverty from textbooks and treats it like an abstract problem to solve. I need someone who understands it's about people, real people with real lives. Someone like my mother was. Someone like you are. Maya stared at the proposal, her mind racing. This could change everything. She could pay off her debt, move out of her cramped studio, stop working herself to exhaustion. But more than that, she could actually help people, could build programs that might keep other daughters from watching their mothers die because they couldn't afford treatment, could create safety nets for people falling through the cracks. It was almost too perfect. What's the catch? She asked. There has to be a catch. Alexander met her eyes. The catch is that you'll be working for me and I don't know if I'm someone you can trust yet. I've spent 23 years being someone I'm not proud of, a corporate shark who cared more about profits than people. I'm trying to change, but change is hard. I might stumble. I might fall back into old patterns. And I need someone who will call me out when I do, who won't let me hide behind my money and power. That's the real job I'm asking you to do. Keep me honest, keep me human. The vulnerability in his admission moved Maya deeply. This wasn't a billionaire playing at charity or trying to buy good press. This was a man genuinely trying to honor his mother's memory, to become the person she'd raised him to be. And he was asking Maya not just to accept his help, but to help him in return, to be the conscience he'd lost when grief consumed him. It was a massive responsibility, but somehow it felt right. Okay, Maya said, her decision crystallizing. I'll do it. But on one condition. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Name it. You have to promise me that this isn't about guilt or obligation. If we're going to work together, if we're going to try to build something meaningful, it has to be because you truly want to change, not because you feel like you owe me for saving your grandmother. I need to know that when things get hard, when the work gets messy and complicated, you won't just throw money at problems and walk away. I need your commitment, not your charity. Alexander extended his hand. You have my word. And to prove it, I want to make this a partnership, not employer and employee. Partners. Equal stakes. Equal voice. Equal responsibility. We'll co-direct the outreach division. Your expertise in understanding communities, my resources and business connections. Together. Maya hesitated, then took his hand. The handshake sealed something that went beyond a job offer. It was a pact, a shared commitment to honor the women who'd shaped them, to build something that would outlast their grief and transform it into purpose. As their hands clasped, Maya felt a spark of electricity, a connection that was more than professional. She quickly released his hand, unsettled by the feeling. Alexander seemed to feel it too. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "There's one more thing. My grandmother wants you to have something." He crossed to a small cabinet and opened it, revealing a wooden box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a phoenix rising from flames. "It was my mother's," Alexander said. "She wore it every day. Said it reminded her that we can always rise from our ashes, that endings are also beginning. When she got too sick to wear it, she gave it to my grandmother and made her promise to give it to someone who embodied that same spirit, someone who'd been through fire and chose to rise rather than stay down. My grandmother thinks that someone is you." Maya couldn't speak. The necklace was beautiful, but more than that, it was sacred. A talisman passed from a woman she'd never met but felt connected to through the grief and hope they shared. "I can't take this," Maya finally managed. "It's too precious. It should stay in your family." "You are family," Alexander said simply. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice, by action. You saved my grandmother's life. You're helping me find my way back to being someone my mother would recognize. That makes you family in every way that matters." He lifted the necklace from the box and gestured for permission. "May I?" Maya turned, lifting her hair, and felt the cool silver settle against her skin as Alexander fastened the clasp. His fingers brushed her neck, and again that spark of connection. When she turned back, they were standing very close, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with possibility. But then Alexander stepped back, maintaining the professional distance even as his eyes betrayed something deeper. "It looks perfect on you," he said quietly. "Like it was made for you." Maya touched the phoenix pendant, feeling its weight, its warmth from Alexander's hands. "Thank you," she said. "I'll honor it. I promise." "That's all I ask," Alexander said. They stood there in Catherine's office, surrounded by her legacy, her dreams, her unfinished work, and Maya realized that this was what resurrection looked like. Not a dramatic rising from death, but a quiet choice to continue, to honor, to transform pain into purpose. Catherine was gone, but her spirit lived on in the grandson who was finally choosing to live the values she'd taught him, in the grandmother who'd survived her grief long enough to see hope rekindled, and now in Maya, who wore her phoenix as a promise to keep rising no matter how many times life knocked her down. When Alexander walked Maya out, offering to call her a car that she again politely declined, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs in her robe. She watched them say their goodbyes, watched Maya touch the phoenix pendant with reverence, and smiled through her tears. At the door, Alexander paused. "Tomorrow," he said, "come to my office. We'll start planning. We'll figure out how to do this right." Maya nodded. "Tomorrow," she agreed. And as she walked down the driveway into the softly falling snow, she touched the phoenix at her throat and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she wasn't just surviving, she was beginning to live again. The next morning, Maya stood outside the gleaming tower that housed Ashford Industries, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored glass. She barely recognized herself. She'd worn her best outfit, the black dress from the previous evening paired with a blazer she'd found at a thrift store. But it was the necklace that transformed her. The phoenix caught the morning light, seeming to glow with its own inner fire. Maya touched it for courage and pushed through the revolving doors into a world she'd only ever glimpsed from the outside. The lobby was all marble and steel and possibly high ceilings and the hushed whisper of wealth. People in expensive suits moved with purpose, their shoes clicking on the polished floor like a corporate symphony. Maya approached the security desk, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. The guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, smiled at her. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Alexander Ashford," Maya said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. "I'm Maya Chun. He's expecting me." The guard checked his computer and his eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh yes, Miss Ashford left explicit instructions. You're to go straight up to the executive floor. 80th floor. He'll meet you there." He handed her a security badge with her photo already on it. "Welcome to Ashford Industries, Ms. Chun." The elevator ride up was disorienting. Maya watched the numbers climb, feeling like she was ascending into another dimension. When the doors opened on the 80th floor, she stepped into a space that was somehow both intimidating and beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. She could see her neighborhood from here, a tiny cluster of buildings in the distance. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, cleanly organized into blocks and sectors. But Maya knew the truth. Down there in those streets, people were struggling, surviving, hoping. That's what she was here to remember, to make sure the view from up here never made her forget the reality down there. Maya. Alexander's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was walking toward her, and for the first time she saw him in his natural habitat. He commanded the space effortlessly, his presence filling the expansive office. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her old salary, but his smile was warm, genuine. "Thank you for coming. I know this must feel overwhelming." "It is," Maya admitted. "I feel like I've stepped onto another planet." Alexander's smile turned rueful. "I know the feeling. After my mother died, when I threw myself into building this company, I felt like I was creating a world where I could control everything, where loss couldn't touch me. But all I really did was build a very expensive cage. Come on, let me show you something. He led her through the executive suite, past offices where serious-looking people typed on computers and spoke in hushed tones. They reached a conference room, and Alexander opened. Inside, a large table was covered with papers, maps, and photographs. "This is every community outreach program we've funded in the last 10 years, Alexander said, gesturing to the overwhelming display. "Programs for after-school care, job training, food security, housing assistance. We've spent millions, and most of it has been wasted." Maya walked around the table picking up reports at random. The language was corporate, sterile, full of metrics and deliverables, but nowhere did she see actual people, actual stories, actual impact. "What do you mean wasted?" she asked. Alexander picked up a particularly thick report. "This one is my favorite example of how not to help people. We funded a job training program in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Spent $500,000 teaching people skills for jobs that don't exist in their community. The program director, who'd never set foot in that neighborhood before we hired him, designed a curriculum based on what he thought poor people needed, not what they actually needed. The graduation rate was 12%. Of those who completed the program, fewer than 20% found employment. We declared it a success because it met our initial enrollment targets. We literally measured success by how many people signed up, not by how many people's lives actually improved." Maya felt anger rising in her chest. "So you spent $500,000 to make yourselves feel good while doing almost nothing to actually help people. That's not outreach. That's performance." "Exactly," Alexander said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only weary agreement. "That's what I realized when I started really looking at what we've been doing. We've been playing at charity, using other people's poverty to burnish our corporate image. My mother would have been ashamed. I am ashamed." He looked at Maya directly. "That's why I need you. I don't know how to do this right. I was raised in privilege, educated in institutions where poor people were statistics in textbooks, but, you've lived it. So tell me, how do we do better?" Maya set down the report she'd been holding. "You start by listening," she said. "Not to experts with degrees and theories, but to the people you're trying to help. You go into communities and ask them what they need, not what you think they need. You hire people from those communities, give them decision-making power, compensate them fairly for their expertise, because living through poverty makes you an expert in poverty. You build partnerships with local organizations that already exist and are already doing the work. You don't create new structures and expect people to adapt to you. You adapt to them. And most importantly, you measure success by actual outcomes, not enrollment numbers or publicity, by whether people's lives tangibly improved." Alexander listened intently, and Maya saw him pulling out his phone, taking notes. She felt a surge of something like power. For the first time in years, someone was not just hearing her words, but valuing them, treating them as essential truth. When she finished, Alexander looked up from his phone. "Okay," he said. "So let's start there. Let's go listen." "Now?" Maya asked, surprised. "Right now," Alexander confirmed. "I've cleared my calendar for the week. Actually, for the next month. Everything else can wait. This is the most important work I'll do. Where should we start?" Maya thought for a moment, then felt the phoenix pendant warm against her skin. "There's a community center in my neighborhood," she said. "It's run by a woman named Rosa Martinez. She's been serving that community for 30 years on basically no budget. She feeds people, helps them with housing applications, tutors kids, mediates conflicts. She's a miracle worker. If you want to learn how to actually help people, Rosa is your teacher." An hour later, Maya and Alexander were in the back of a town car heading toward Maya's neighborhood. The driver seemed uncertain as they moved from the gleaming downtown into streets that grew progressively rougher, buildings more worn. Alexander stared out the window, and Maya watched him, seeing her world for the first time. There was no judgment in his expression, only a kind of dawning understanding. "This is where you live?" he asked quietly. "3 blocks from here," Maya confirmed. "That's my bus stop, the one where I wait 45 minutes sometimes because the buses don't run regularly in poor neighborhoods. That corner store charges twice what groceries cost in your neighborhood because it's the only one for miles, and they know people have no choice. See that building with the broken windows? That's where Mrs. Patterson lives. A woman who worked 3 jobs her whole life and still can't afford to fix her heat. This is the reality that doesn't show up in your reports." Alexander was quiet, absorbing it all. Then he said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" Maya asked. "For being blind," he said. "For living in a city and not seeing half of it. For being part of a system that allows this. For not doing something sooner." "Your apology doesn't fix anything," Maya said, not unkindly. "But your action might. That's why we're here." The community center was a modest building that had once been a church. The paint was peeling, but someone had planted flowers in boxes beneath the windows. A small act of defiance against decay. As they walked in, Maya was immediately enveloped in familiar sounds and smells. Children laughing, the scent of cooking food, the hum of activity and life. A woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that missed nothing, looked up from where she was helping a young mother fill out forms. "Maya-chun," Rosa called out, her face breaking into a huge smile. "Where have you been, Maya?" "I've been worried. Working." Maya said, crossing to embrace the older woman. Rosa, I want you to meet someone. This is Alexander Ashford. We're going to be working together on community programs, and I told him he needed to meet you first. Rosa's sharp eyes assessed Alexander, taking in his expensive suit, his obvious discomfort in these surroundings. She didn't extend her hand immediately, and Maya appreciated her wariness. Rich people came through sometimes, took photos for their websites, and disappeared. Rosa had learned to be skeptical. What kind of programs? Rosa asked, her tone neutral. Programs that actually work, Alexander said, meeting her gaze directly. I run a company that has spent millions of dollars on community outreach and accomplished almost nothing because we didn't know what we were doing. We designed programs based on assumptions instead of reality. Maya has agreed to help me do better, but she says you're the real expert. I'm here to learn from you if you'll teach me. Rosa studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Okay, she said. You want to learn? Take off that fancy jacket and come help me in the kitchen. We're making lunch for 80 people with a budget of $30. You can learn a lot about community in a kitchen. To his credit, Alexander didn't hesitate. He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and followed Rosa. Maya watched as he was put to work chopping vegetables, stirring giant pots, setting up tables. Rosa worked him hard, talking the entire time about the community, the families she served, the impossible choices people had to make between medicine and food, rent and heat. She introduced him to the people who came through, single mothers working multiple jobs, elderly folks on fixed incomes, kids who came for a safe place as much as for food. Alexander listened to each person's story, and Maya saw something shifting in him, some last wall crumbling. By the time lunch was served, Alexander had been fully absorbed into the rhythm of the center. He served food, bus tables, sat with an elderly man who wanted to talk about his time in the war. When a fight broke out between two teenagers, Maya watched Alexander step in, not with authority but with genuine concern, listening to both sides and helping them find their own resolution. This wasn't the billionaire CEO, this was the man his mother had raised him to be, finally emerging from behind the armor of wealth. As the afternoon wound down and they were cleaning up, Rosa pulled Maya aside. That one, she said, nodding toward Alexander, who was laughing with a group of kids, teaching them some kind of card game. He's got a good heart underneath all that money. But you be careful, Mija. Men like that, they mean well, but their world and ours, they don't mix easy. Sometimes good intentions aren't enough. I know, Maya said, watching Alexander, but I think he's really trying. And besides, we're partners now. Equals. Rosa raised an eyebrow. Equals? With a billionaire? Maya, I love you, but be realistic. Money is power. You can't be equals when one of you has all the power. Maya touched the phoenix at her throat, feeling its weight. Then I'll just have to make sure I don't forget who I am, she said, no matter how high I rise. Over the next 3 weeks, Maya and Alexander fell into an intense rhythm of work that consumed them both. They spent their days visiting communities, meeting with local leaders, listening to stories of struggle and resilience. Alexander proved to be a quick learner, absorbing everything with the same fierce focus he'd once applied to building his empire. But now, instead of acquiring assets, he was acquiring understanding. Maya watched him transform from a man who saw poverty as a problem to be solved into someone who understood it as a lived experience to be honored and addressed with humility. They worked side by side, often late into the night, designing programs that were radically different from anything Ashford Industries had done before. Instead of top-down initiatives, they created community-led projects with local people making the decisions. Instead of temporary interventions, they built sustainable systems that could outlive any single grant cycle. Maya insisted on hiring people from the communities they serve, paying them consultant wages for their expertise. Alexander initially balked at the cost until Maya pointed out that he spent more on office furniture than he was proposing, to pay people who held the knowledge that could make or break their entire initiative. Their partnership was electric, charged with a creative energy that surprised them both. Alexander brought resources and connections, while Maya brought insight and authenticity. When they disagreed, which was often, they argued passionately but respectfully, each pushing the other to think deeper, do better. Maya challenged Alexander's assumptions about efficiency and scale, reminding him that helping people wasn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. Alexander challenged Maya's skepticism about systemic change, showing her that with the right resource commitment, they could create ripples that became waves. They were good together in a way that went beyond professional complementarity. There was something else there, a connection that neither of them was quite ready to name. Margaret noticed it, of course. Maya had become a regular visitor to the mansion, often joining grandmother and grandson for dinner after long workdays. Margaret would watch them together, heads bent over proposals, finishing each other's sentences, and she would smile with a knowing look that made Maya blush. One evening, after Alexander had stepped away to take a call, Margaret reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "You're good for him," she said. "I haven't seen him this alive, this present, since before Catherine died. Thank you for that." "I'm not doing anything special," Maya protested. "I'm just working with him." Margaret laughed softly. "Oh, my dear, you're doing something very special indeed. You're showing him that it's safe to care again, to let someone in. He's been alone for so long, built such high walls. But with you, those walls come down. I can see it in the way he looks at you. Maya felt her cheeks flush. We're just colleagues, partners. Margaret's knowing smile deepened. Of course you are. And I was just friends with my late husband for 3 years before either of us admitted we were in love. Sometimes the heart knows before the head is ready to accept it. Before Maya could respond, Alexander returned and the moment passed, but Margaret's words stayed with her, echoing in her mind during the quiet moments. When she caught Alexander looking at her with an expression that went beyond professional respect, she tried to dismiss it, tried to maintain the boundaries they'd established, but the truth was, she felt it too. The pull toward him, the way her heart raced when he smiled, the longing for his good opinion, the ache when they parted at the end of each day. It scared her, not just because of the obvious complications of falling for your business partner, or the massive power imbalance that Rosa had warned her about, but because opening her heart again after losing her mother, after learning that loving someone meant risking devastating loss, felt dangerous. She'd built her own walls, different from Alexander's but just as high. Letting them down felt like inviting pain, so she focused on the work, throwing herself into it with an intensity that left no room for complicated feeling. They were making real progress. The first round of programs was launching in a week, and Maya had never been prouder of anything in her life. But not everyone was pleased with the changes Alexander was making. Corporate boardrooms and executive suites buzzed with discontent. Maya first learned about the opposition when she arrived at the office one morning to find Alexander in a heated discussion with 3 men in expensive suits. She recognized one of them from photos in the company lobby, Richard Ashford, Alexander's uncle, who sat on the company's board of directors. The conversation stopped abruptly when she entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Ems, Chun," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We were just discussing your new initiatives. How fortunate that you're here. Perhaps you can explain to us why my nephew is proposing to spend $15 million on programs that have no clear return on investment." Maya met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Mr. Ashford, if you're looking for financial return on community outreach, you're missing the point of outreach entirely." Richard's smile was cold. "The point of any business expenditure is to benefit the business. Community outreach is supposed to enhance our corporate image, create goodwill that translates into favorable contracts and positive press. Your programs do none of that. You're essentially proposing we give away money to people who will never be our customers, never contribute to our bottom line. It's not business. It's charity, and poorly conceived charity at that." Alexander stepped forward, his voice sharp. "These programs honor my mother's legacy. She believed that corporations have a responsibility to the communities they operate in beyond simple profit extraction. Your mother was a wonderful woman," Richard said, his tone patronizing, "but she wasn't a businesswoman. If she had been, she might have understood that sentiment doesn't pay salaries or maintain shareholder value. Alexander, you've been through a difficult time. Your grandmother's near-death experience clearly affected, but you can't let emotion drive business decisions." Maya felt anger rising in her chest. She'd encountered this attitude before, this casual dismissal of human suffering in the name of profit, but she'd never had the platform to challenge it, until now. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice calm but forceful, "let me explain something to you. The communities we're investing in are the same communities your company has extracted value from for decades. Your real estate developments displace families. Your construction projects gentrified neighborhoods, driving up costs and forcing out longtime residents. Your success was built in part on their displacement. What we're doing isn't charity. It's restoration. It's paying a debt your company has owed for years but never acknowledged." The room went silent. Richard's face flushed red. "How dare you come into our company and lecture us about our business practices? You're a waitress playing at consulting. You have no credentials, no experience, no standing to question how we operate." Alexander's voice cut through like a blade. "That's enough. Maya's not a waitress anymore. She's the co-director of our community outreach division, my partner in this work, and she speaks with my full authority. And she's absolutely right. We've taken from these communities for years. It's time we gave something back." Richard looked at his nephew with something close to contempt. "Your mother's sentimentality has infected you. She filled your head with naive idealism that has no place in the real world. If you continue down this path, I'll call for a vote of no confidence at the next board meeting. You may own controlling shares, but you can still be removed as CEO if the board deems you unfit." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Maya felt panic rising. She'd seen firsthand the good Alexander was doing, the man he was becoming. The thought of him being forced out, of all their work being undone, was unbearable. But Alexander didn't flinch. "Then call your vote, Uncle Richard, and I'll explain to the board and to the press exactly why you're trying to remove. I'll make sure everyone knows that Ashford Industries is at a crossroads. We can either continue to be a company that extracts wealth from communities while pretending to care, or we can actually become the force for good we claim to be in our mission statement. Let the board decide which version of our company they want to be part of, and if they choose your way, I'll step down. But I'll take my story public. Let's see how shareholders react when they learn what we've really been doing with our outreach budget." Richard's face went through several shades of red. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk the company's reputation." "I'm not bluffing," Alexander said, "and I'm not risking the company's reputation. I'm trying to save it. from people like you who think that profit is the only thing that matters. Richard stared at his nephew for a long moment, then turned on his heel and walked out, the other board members following. The door slammed behind them, and the silence that followed felt oppressive. Maya looked at Alexander, who was standing rigid, his jaw clenched. She could see the toll the confrontation had taken on him. "You didn't have to defend me like that," she said quietly. "You might have just made a powerful enemy." Alexander turned to her, and she was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Yes, I did have to defend you, because you were right and he was wrong, and because I'm tired of living in a world where profit is the only value that matters. My mother died trying to teach me that, and I ignored her. I won't ignore it anymore, even if it costs me everything." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Maya felt something shift in her chest, some final resistance crumbling. This man, this complicated, broken, striving man, was willing to risk everything he'd built for what was right. How could she not care for him? How could she keep pretending this was just a professional partnership? But before she could speak, before she could acknowledge the feeling that was growing too large to ignore, Alexander's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "It's my grandmother," he said, and answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause, and Maya watched the color drain further from his face. "I'll be right there," he said, and hung up. "What happened?" Maya asked, already knowing from his expression that it was bad. "Margaret collapsed," Alexander said, his voice shaking. "She's in the hospital. They think it might be a stroke." He looked at Maya, and she saw fear in his eyes, raw and devastating. "I can't lose her too. Not now. Not when we've just found each other again." Without thinking, Maya crossed to him and took his hand. "You won't lose her, and you won't face this alone. I'm coming with you." Alexander squeezed her hand, and in that grip, Maya felt everything neither of them had been brave enough to say. "Let's go," she said, and together they ran. The hospital waiting room had become a familiar purgatory. Maya sat beside Alexander in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their shoulders touching, neither of them speaking. 3 hours had passed since they'd arrived to find Margaret unconscious. Doctors rushing around her with the controlled urgency that Maya remembered all too well from her mother's final days. The neurologist had explained that Margaret had suffered a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, brought on by stress and her already compromised cardiovascular system. She was stable now, resting, but the doctor's words carried an unspoken warning. This was a preview of what could come if things didn't change. Alexander hadn't moved from his chair since the doctor left. His hands were clasped between his knees, his head bowed, and Maya could feel the guilt radiating off him in waves. She knew that feeling intimately. The savage voice that whispers, "You should have done more, been better, noticed sooner." It was the voice that had haunted her through her mother's illness. The voice that still woke her in the night sometimes. She reached out and placed her hand on his back, feeling the tension in his muscle, the way he was holding himself together through sheer will. "This isn't your fault," she said quietly. Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Hollow, isn't it? Put her through hell for 23 years. Ignored her, kept her at a distance, let her live alone in that massive house feeling abandoned. Then, in the past few weeks, I've been so consumed with the work, with proving I can be better, that I haven't noticed she was struggling. The doctor said stress was a factor. I am the stress." Maya moved her hand to his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You're also the reason she's been happier these past weeks than she has been in years. She told me that. Said having you back, really back, was worth everything. This isn't because you failed her, Alexander. This is just life being cruel and random, the way it sometimes is. You can't control everything, and you can't prevent every loss. Believe me, I tried. I fought so hard to save my mother, did everything right, and I still lost her. Some things are beyond our power." Alexander lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "How did you survive it, losing your mother? How did you not let it destroy you?" Maya felt tears prickling her own eyes. "Who says it didn't destroy me?" she said softly. "The person I was before my mother got sick, that Maya died with her. The person I am now is who got built from the wreckage. Some days I'm stronger for it. Some days I'm just broken in different ways. You survive because you have to, because giving up would dishonor the person you lost, because somewhere deep down you still believe life is worth living even when it hurts like hell." They sat in silence for a moment, bound by their shared understanding of grief. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Maya. I'm terrified that I'll lose her, that I wasted 23 years I could have had with her, and that I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. And I'm scared that even if she recovers, I don't know how to be what she needs, how to be the grandson she deserves." "You're already being him," Maya said. "You're here. You're present, trying. That's all anyone can do. The trying is what matters." Alexander turned to look at her fully, and Maya saw something shift in his expression. "You're extraordinary, you know that? You come into my life and my grandmother's life completely by chance, and you save us. Not just that night in the storm, but every day since. You've shown me how to be human again, how to care, how to see people. I don't know what I would have done without you these past weeks. Probably collapsed under the weight of my own inadequacy." Maya felt her breath catch. The intensity of his gaze, the raw honesty in his words, broke through the last of her defenses. "I didn't do anything you weren't already capable of," she said. "I just reminded you of what you'd forgotten. But you did the work, Alexander. You chose to change. You chose to face your grief and your guilt. That's all you, not me." They were leaning closer now, drawn together by something neither of them had named, but both of them felt. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, with the antiseptic smell of the hospital surrounding them and the fear of loss hovering over them like a specter, They were finding something unexpected. Not just partnership or friendship, but the beginning of something deeper, something that terrified Maya as much as it drew her in. Alexander reached up and touched the phoenix pendant at her throat, his fingers brushing her collarbone. "My mother would have loved you," he said again, echoing what Margaret had said that first night. "Not just because you saved my grandmother, but because you're exactly the kind of person she wanted me to find. Someone real, someone who wouldn't let me hide, someone who makes me want to be better." Maya covered his hand with hers, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that revealed he was just as affected as she was. "I'm not perfect," she said. "I'm broken too. I have my own walls, my own fears. I don't know if I know how to let someone in again." "Then we'll figure it out together," Alexander said. "We'll be broken together and maybe help each other heal, if you'll let me, if you want this too." Before Maya could answer, before she could voice the yes that was forming on her lips, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Ashford, your grandmother is awake. She's asking for both of you." They sprang apart, the moment shattered but not forgotten. They followed the nurse down the quiet corridor to Margaret's room. When they entered, Margaret looked small and fragile in the hospital bed. Her silver hair spread across the pillow, but her eyes were alert and focused. When she saw them together, saw their clasped hands, a weak smile crossed her face. "There you are," she said, her voice thin but steady. "My two favorite people. Stop looking so worried. I'm not going anywhere yet." Alexander crossed to her bedside and took her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "Grandmother, you scared us." "I'm allowed to scare you once in a while," Margaret said with a touch of her usual spirit. "Keeps you on your toes. Besides, I had to make sure you two would finally admit what's been obvious to everyone else for weeks." She looked pointedly at their still joined hands. "Life is too short to waste time pretending you don't care about each other. Trust me, I know. I spent 23 years pretending it was okay to be apart from my grandson because I was too afraid to push, too afraid of rejection. Look where that got us. Don't make the same mistake." Maya felt tears streaming down her face. "You need to rest, not worry about us." "I'll rest when I'm dead," Margaret said firmly. "Right now, I need to know that you two will take care of each other. Promise me." Alexander looked at Maya and she saw the question in his eyes. She thought about Rose's warning, about the power imbalance, about all the logical reasons why this was complicated and possibly unwise. But she also thought about what Margaret had said, about life being too short, about the courage it took to reach for connection, even when loss was possible. She thought about the phoenix at her throat, about rising from ashes, about second chances and new beginnings. And she made her choice. "I promise," Maya said, squeezing Alexander's hand. "We'll take care of each other." Alexander's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "I promise too," he said, "both to you and to each other." Margaret sighed with satisfaction. "Good. Now there's something else I need to tell you both. Something I've been keeping from you, Alexander, because I was ashamed, but I can't keep it anymore." The mini-stroke was a warning. I need to listen to it. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, tension returning to his voice. Margaret took a breath. "I haven't been taking my medications properly. After Catherine died, after you left, I stopped caring whether I lived or died. I went through the motions, but I wasn't really trying. When I wandered out into that storm, it wasn't entirely confusion or wanting air. Part of me, a dark part I'm not proud of, wanted it to be over, wanted to join my daughter. But then Maya saved me and you came back, and I remembered what it felt like to want to live. These past weeks, having you both in my life, I've been happier than I've been in decades. But I've also been stressed, terrified that I'd lose it again, that you'd realize you didn't really need me." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Alexander looked stricken. "You've always been needed. Always. I'm the one who made you feel otherwise, and I will never forgive myself for that." Margaret reached up and touched his face. "Then don't waste energy on guilt. Waste it on living, on building something beautiful with Maya, on making the company into what Catherine dreamed it could be. On visiting me not out of obligation but because you want to. On creating a life that honors the people we've lost by embracing the people we still have. Can you do that?" Alexander nodded, unable to speak. Maya stepped forward and took Margaret's other hand. "We'll do it together," she said. "All three of us. We're family now, not by blood but by choice, and that's just as real." Margaret smiled, her eyes drifting closed with exhaustion. "Yes," she murmured. "Family by choice. That's the best kind." As she drifted into sleep, Maya and Alexander stood on either side of her bed, connected across her body, forming a triangle of love and commitment. The hospital room felt less sterile now, warmed by something intangible but powerful. They had faced loss before, separately, and it had nearly destroyed them both, but now they faced the possibility of future loss together, and somehow that made all the difference. Later, after Margaret's breathing had deepened into true sleep and the nurses had assured them she was stable for the night, Alexander and Maya walked out of the hospital into the cool evening air. The city was alive around them, indifferent to their small drama, but Maya felt like everything had shifted. She turned to Alexander, and without words they came together. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then it deepened, becoming something more urgent, more real, a claiming and a promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Of this, of us, of losing what we're building." "Good," Maya said. "So am I. Fear means we understand what's at stake. It means we're not taking this lightly. And as long as we're honest with each other, as long as we keep choosing each other every day, we'll be okay." Alexander kissed her again, softer this time. "Then I choose you," he said. "Today and every day after. I choose us." Maya smiled against his lips. "I choose us too." she whispered. And in that moment, standing outside a hospital where loss had threatened them again, they chose hope instead, chose love instead. Chose to rise from their ashes together and build something new. Margaret came home a week later, stronger but changed. The mini-stroke had been a wake-up call that she took seriously. She committed to her medications, to regular checkups, to letting people help her. But more than that, she committed to living rather than just existing. The mansion that had felt like a mausoleum began to transform. Margaret hired staff not to maintain a museum, but to help her create a home. She opened the closed rooms, let light and air in, began filling the space with life. She invited Rosa Martinez and some of the families from the community center for dinner, bridging the worlds that Maya and Alexander were trying to connect. The house rang with laughter and conversation for the first time in decades. Maya spent more time there, officially to help Margaret, but really because it had become a second home. She and Alexander were navigating their new relationship with care, taking things slowly despite the intensity of their feeling. They were both damaged people, learning to trust again, to be vulnerable, to believe that love didn't have to end in loss. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Margaret watched them with undisguised joy, often leaving them alone in the breakfast nook or the library, giving them space to discover each other. She'd become their biggest champion, their co-conspirator in building this new life together. But outside the sanctuary of the mansion, the battle for Ashford Industries was intensifying. Richard had made good on his threat, calling for a special board meeting to vote on Alexander's leadership. The date was set for 3 weeks after Margaret's hospitalization, and as it approached, the tension built. Alexander spent long hours preparing his defense, documenting every decision, every program, every outcome. Maya worked beside him, helping him craft a narrative that was both emotionally compelling and financially sound. They weren't just fighting for their program. They were fighting for a vision of what corporate responsibility could look like. The night before the board meeting, Maya found Alexander in his study at home, surrounded by papers, looking exhausted and defeated. "I don't know if I can do this," he said when she entered. "Richard has half the board already convinced that I'm throwing away company resources on feel-good nonsense. They see community outreach as marketing, nothing more. They don't understand why we're spending money on programs that don't directly benefit shareholders." Maya crossed to him and took his hands, pulling him up from his chair. "Then show them," she said. "Don't just tell them with numbers and projections. Show them the real impact. Bring the people we've helped. Let them tell their stories. Make it impossible for the board to see this as abstract. Make them see the humanity in what we're doing." Alexander looked at her like she just handed him the missing piece of a puzzle. "You're brilliant," he said, kissing her soundly. "How did I ever live without you?" "You didn't," Maya said simply. "You just survived. Now you're living. There's a difference." They spent the rest of the night reaching out to community members, to the families whose lives had been touched by the new programs. To Maya's surprise and delight, every single person they called agreed to come. Rosa Martinez organized transportation, coordinating with other community leaders to bring a delegation. By morning, they had 15 people ready to speak, ready to be witnesses to what compassion and resources could accomplish when combined with genuine understanding. The boardroom of Ashford Industries was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling, a table that could seat 30, walls lined with portraits of past leaders. Richard had packed the room with allies, board members who saw the company as nothing more than a vehicle for profit. But Alexander had packed it too, with people who represented something more important than quarterly earnings. They sat in chairs along the walls, a diverse group of men and women, young and old, representing the communities that Ashford Industries operated in but had rarely truly seen. The board members eyed them with confusion and barely concealed disdain. This was unprecedented. Board meetings were sterile affairs of numbers and strategy, not populated with actual people from the real world. Richard called the meeting to order, his expression smug. He'd clearly expected Alexander to come alone, armed only with spreadsheets and defensive arguments. Instead, he found himself facing a room full of witnesses. "Let's get to the matter at hand," Richard began. "This board has been called together to address serious concerns about our CEO's judgment. In the past 2 months, Alexander has diverted over $15 million from productive investments into community programs that serve no strategic purpose. He's hired unqualified personnel, including his co-director, who has no business background whatsoever. And he's publicly stated his intention to prioritize social responsibility over shareholder value. This is not just poor judgment. It's a fundamental betrayal of his fiduciary duty." There were murmurs of agreement from several board members. Richard was building his case methodically, making Alexander sound like a reckless idealist who'd lost sight of his responsibilities. But before he could continue, Alexander stood. "You're right about one thing, Uncle Richard. I have changed my priorities. But it's not a betrayal of my duty. It's a fulfillment of it. Ashford Industries was built by my great-grandfather on a promise to build communities, not just buildings. We've lost sight of that promise, and it's cost us more than money. It's cost us our soul." He gestured to Maya. "Miss Chun has no business degree, that's true, but she has something far more valuable. She has lived experience, moral clarity, and the courage to speak truth to power. She's made me a better leader, and this company better serves the world because of her." Then Alexander did something unexpected. He turned to the people lining the walls. But don't take my word for it. Listen to theirs. One by one, the community members stood and spoke. A single mother named Teresa talked about the childcare program that allowed allowed her to go back to school, how she was 6 months away from becoming a registered nurse, how she'd be able to provide for her children in ways she'd never dreamed possible. An elderly man named James spoke about the senior services program that had helped him avoid eviction, how volunteers had connected him with benefits he didn't know he qualified for, how he was living with dignity instead of dying on the streets. A teenager named Marcus described the mentorship program that had kept him out of gangs, how he'd discovered a love of engineering, how he'd been accepted to college with a full scholarship. Story after story, they painted a picture not of wasted resources, but of lives transformed, of potential unlocked, of communities strengthened. And Maya watched the board members' faces change. Some remained stone-faced, unmoved by anything that couldn't be quantified in a spreadsheet, but others began to shift uncomfortably, began to see these programs not as abstract line items, but as real interventions in real lives. When the last person had spoken, Rosa Martinez, she hadn't been on the list, but Maya had known she wouldn't be able to stay silent. "I've been serving my community for 30 years, Rosa said, her voice carrying authority born of experience. "I've watched companies like yours come in, make promises, take what you want, and leave nothing behind. You extract value and call it progress. But Mr. Ashford and Miss Chun, they're different. They didn't come in with solutions. They came in with questions. They asked us what we needed and actually listened to the answer. They hired people from our communities, paid them fairly, treated them with respect. The programs they've built aren't charity, they're partnership. They're what corporate responsibility should look like." She turned to address the board directly. "I know you're worried about money, about returns on investment, but let me tell you what I've learned in 30 years. Communities remember. They remember who helped and who hurt. They remember who saw them as people and who saw them as obstacles or opportunities. Mr. Ashford, building goodwill that will last generations. The young people his programs have touched, they'll remember. When they're adults with purchasing power, with influence, they'll remember who invested in them. That's not a 3-month return. That's a 30-year return. That's building a legacy instead of just extracting profit." The room fell silent after Rosa finished. Alexander looked at Maya and she nodded encouragement. He turned back to the board. "I'm not asking you to choose between profit and principle," Alexander said. "I'm asking you to understand that they're not opposed. Companies that invest in communities, that build real relationships, that operate with genuine values, those companies thrive long term. Look at our numbers for the past 2 months. Since we launched these programs, our employee retention is up 17%. Recruiting costs are down. The communities where we operate have stopped protesting our developments and started partnering with us. We're getting contracts we never would have gotten before because people trust us now. The programs cost $15 million. But the goodwill, the partnerships, the reputation we're building, that's worth 10 times that amount." He pulled up a presentation on the screen showing data that he and Maya had compiled, metrics that demonstrated not just social impact but business impact. Richard tried to interrupt to poke holes in the methodology, but the numbers were solid. Alexander had learned from Maya how to measure what mattered, and now he was showing the board that what mattered also happened to be good business. As the presentation concluded, Alexander made his final argument. "My mother, Catherine Ashford, believed that businesses have souls, that we're not just economic entities, but moral actors in the world. When she died, I forgot that. I built walls and chased profits and convinced myself I was honoring her memory by being successful. But I was dishonoring her by ignoring everything she actually cared about. These past 2 months, working with Maya, listening to communities, building programs that actually help people, this is the first time in 23 years that I've felt like I'm living the life my mother wanted me to live. So vote me out if you want. But know that if you do, you're not just removing a CEO, you're killing a vision of what this company could be." The vote was called. Maya held her breath as hands were raised. Richard voted against Alexander as expected, along with 4 other board members who'd already made their allegiances clear. But 7 board members voted to keep Alexander as CEO. It wasn't a landslide, but it was decisive. Alexander was staying. The relief that flooded through Maya was so intense she felt dizzy. They'd won, not just the vote, but something more important. They'd made the case that business could be a force for good, that profit and principle could coexist. As the board members filed out, several stopped to speak with the community members, asking questions, exchanging cards. Seeds were being planted. After everyone had left, Alexander found Maya standing by the window, looking out over the city. "We did it," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You did it," Maya corrected. "You found your courage. I just reminded you it was there." They stood together in the empty boardroom, watching the sun set over the city they were working to change. It wasn't perfect. Richard was still on the board, still hostile, still looking for ways to undermine. The work ahead was immense, the challenges real, but they had each other. They had Margaret, they had a vision, and the resources to pursue it. And most importantly, they had proof that change was possible, that resurrection was real, that phoenixes could rise from ashes and create something beautiful. 6 months later, on another winter evening when snow fell soft and pure over the city, Maya stood in the transformed breakfast nook of Margaret's mansion, looking out at the garden where lights twinkled in the bare branches. The house was full of people, laughter, and warmth. It was the launch celebration for the Catherine Ashford Foundation, a nonprofit that would carry forward the community work that Maya and Alexander had started within Ashford Industries. The foundation would be independent, fully funded by Alexander's personal fortune, ensuring that the work would continue, regardless of corporate politics or board opinions. Maya touched the phoenix at her throat, a gesture that had become habit, a reminder of how far she'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been a waitress drowning in debt, working double shifts just to survive. Now she was the executive director of a foundation that would serve communities across the city. With a staff of 20 people, most of them hired from the communities they served, her mother's medical debt was paid in full. She'd moved into a comfortable apartment, though she spent most of her time either at the foundation offices or here, in this house that had become her home in every way that mattered. Margaret appeared at her elbow, looking radiant in a deep blue dress that matched her eyes. She'd aged in reverse these past months, the lines of loneliness and sorrow smoothing away, replaced by joy and purpose. She'd become the foundation's advisory board chair, using her decades of experience and her extensive social connections to open doors and raise funds. But more than that, she'd found her calling in mentoring the young people the foundation served, becoming a grandmother figure to dozens of kids who needed exactly what she had to offer. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said, linking her arm through Maya's. Maya smiled. "I was just thinking about that night. The night I found you in the snow. If someone had told me then that 6 months later I'd be standing here in your home, launching a foundation in love with your grandson, I would have thought they were crazy." Margaret laughed, the sound like music. Fate works in mysterious ways. Or maybe it's not fate at all. Maybe it's just kindness creating ripples. You chose to help a stranger, and that choice changed everything. Not just for me and Alexander, but for hundreds of people whose lives are different now because of the programs you've built. That's the power of a single act of compassion. Maya felt tears prickling her eyes. My mother used to say that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. I always wanted to believe her, but it was hard when the world felt so cruel. Now I know she was right. Alexander found them there, looking handsome in a dark suit, his eyes lighting up when he saw Maya. "There you are," he said, crossing to kiss her gently. "People are asking for you. Rosa wants to make a toast." As they walked back into the main room, Maya was overwhelmed by the gathering. Quote, Rosa Martinez was there, of course, along with dozens of people from her community center. Teresa, the single mother who was now a nurse, had brought her children. Marcus, the teenager who'd discovered engineering, was home from his first semester of college. James, the elderly man who'd avoided eviction, was playing chess with one of Alexander's former board members who'd become an unexpected ally. The worlds that had seemed so separate were mixing, merging, creating something new. Rosa clinked her glass, calling for attention. When the room quieted, she raised her glass toward Maya. 6 months ago, a young woman ran out into a snowstorm to save a stranger. She didn't think about the risk or the inconvenience. She just saw someone who needed help, and she helped. That simple act of courage started a chain reaction that has touched all of our lives. Maya Chun, you didn't just save Margaret Ashford that night. You saved all of us by reminding us what's possible when we choose compassion over convenience. The room erupted in applause, and Maya felt Alexander's hand squeeze hers. She looked around at all these faces, at the community they'd built together, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what her mother had meant. This was staying soft in a hard world. This was the revolution of everyday kindness. After the toasts and the speeches, after the guests had begun to drift toward food and conversation, Alexander took Maya's hand and led her outside into the garden. Snow was falling gently, each flake catching the light from the house. It should have been cold, but Maya felt only warmth. They walked to a small bench beneath an old oak tree, and Alexander pulled her down beside him. "I have something for you," he said, his voice nervous in a way she'd never heard before. "Maya, these past 6 months have been the best of my life, not because of the foundation or the programs or even winning the board vote, because of you, because you saw me when I was invisible to myself, because you challenged me, believed in me, loved me even when I didn't deserve it. You've made me want to be the man my mother raised me to be, and I don't want to do this life without you. Not for another day." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, with a small diamond flanked by 2 tiny sapphires, the same impossible blue as the phoenix's eye. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's not as grand as you deserve," Alexander said quickly, "but I wanted something that connected to our story, to the phoenix, to the idea that we both rose from our ashes and found each other. Maya Chun, will you marry me? Will you be my partner, not just in work, but in life? Will you build this future with me?" Maya couldn't speak through her tears. She nodded frantically, and Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. When he kissed her, the snow fell around them like a blessing, and Maya felt her mother's presence so strongly it was almost tangible. This was what she'd wanted for Maya, not wealth or status, but love. Real, honest, transformative love. They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other, watching the snow cover the garden in white. Through the windows, they could see Margaret moving through the party, laughing with guests, fully alive. Inside that house, people from every walk of life were mixing, sharing stories, building connection. The foundation would launch tomorrow, and the real work would begin. There would be challenges and setbacks. Richard was still waiting for them to fail. The problems they were trying to address were systemic and vast, but they had something powerful on their side. They had each other. They had a community that believed in them, and they had proof that one person's choice to be kind could change the world. 3 months later, on a spring morning full of promise, Maya and Alexander were married in the garden of the mansion. It was a small ceremony, intimate and perfect. Margaret stood beside Maya, tears streaming down her face as Rosa officiated. The guests were an eclectic mix of society figures and community members, billionaires and struggling families, all gathered to celebrate love that had been born from tragedy and kindness. When Maya walked down the makeshift aisle, she wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and the phoenix necklace gleamed at her throat. Alexander waited for her with eyes full of love and wonder, and when they exchanged vows, they promised not just to love each other, but to honor the people who'd made them who they were, to live in a way that would make Catherine proud, to never forget where they'd come from or the people still struggling to rise. As they were pronounced husband and wife, as Alexander kissed her while their community cheered, Maya felt something settle in her soul. She'd spent 2 years surviving, just getting through each day, but now she was thriving. She'd found her purpose, her family, her love. She'd risen from the ashes of grief and loss to build something beautiful. At the reception, Margaret pulled Maya aside. "My dear girl," she said, holding both of Maya's hands. "Thank you for saving my life, and thank you for saving his. But most of all, thank you for showing us both that it's never too late to start over, that phoenixes can rise at any age." Maya hugged her tightly. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what family does." Years passed, and the Catherine Ashford Foundation grew beyond anything they'd imagined. The programs they'd started expanded to other cities. The model they'd built of community-led initiatives funded by corporate responsibility became a template that other companies began to follow. Maya and Alexander had 2 children, a daughter they named Catherine and a son they named Owen, after Maya's mother, whose middle name had been Catherine, and Maya's grandfather. Margaret lived to meet both of her great-grandchildren, to see the legacy she'd hoped for come to life. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at 92, surrounded by family, her final words were "thank you" for that night in the snow. On the anniversary of the night Maya had found Margaret, the 3 of them before the children, before Margaret's passing, had made it a tradition to visit Rosa's community center. They would cook and serve food, would sit with the people there and listen to their stories. Alexander would often tell anyone who'd listen about the waitress who'd saved his grandmother, and doing so had saved him too. And Maya would touch the phoenix at her throat and remember her mother's words. "Stay soft, stay kind. The world needs more softness." She'd stayed soft, she'd stayed kind, and it had changed everything. The story of the poor waitress who'd saved an elderly woman from freezing snow, and the billionaire's son who'd broken down in tears, became something of a legend in the city. But for Maya, Alexander, and Margaret, it was never a story. It was their life. It was proof that a single moment of courage, one choice to help when it would have been easier to walk away, could ripple out in ways impossible to predict. That kindness was not weakness but the greatest strength. That love was always worth the risk of loss. That families could be built by choice as much as blood. And that no matter how far you fall, no matter how deep the ashes, you can always rise again. You can always become the phoenix. All it takes is one person willing to run out into the storm, to reach for your hand, to remind you that you're not alone. Maya had been that person for Margaret and Alexander, and in saving them, she'd saved herself. That was the real miracle. Not the wealth or the foundation or the programs, though those mattered. The miracle was that 3 broken people had found each other in the darkness and together had created light. And that light would shine for generations to come, warming everyone it touched, reminding them that kindness matters, that love endures, and that every ending is also a beginning.